2019. I was thinking this morning, how many checks are going to look like mine and have that 8 scratched out and have a 9 put on it? Because that's exactly what I did this morning, writing my check for the contribution. But we've got a lot to look forward to this year, and I'm excited about it. I'm glad that you're here for the first Sunday morning Bible class of 2019 as well. Hopefully we can continue talking about good things here as it applies to our study of ethics and how we can make good choices. I want to encourage you to turn to Galatians chapter 2 as we get started this morning. If you've noticed the pattern, hey Jeff Ziegler, it's good to have you back, man. Is it as warm here as it was down in Florida? Don't say 83 degrees. My goodness. Oh, sounds like a lovely time. A lovely time. Well, welcome back to 42 degree Alabama, North Alabama. It may not be this way down at Gulf Shores, but we're still blessed to be here. Amen? There we go. That's a good start. If you've noticed the pattern, I try to start most of our classes with something that may not be directly tied into the major, point, the major emphasis or direction that we go, but just something helpful that maybe doesn't fit with any of the other topics as we study them through class or something like this. But I was actually reminded of this one, reminded of this point over the weekend. On Thursday and Friday, I got to go to Chattanooga and sit in on a workshop called the Gather Conference. It's a brand new group of preachers and teachers in the church talking about leadership, talking about things like that. And one of the speakers took us to Galatians chapter 2 and reminded me that ethics and our spiritual life go hand in hand. We have talked repeatedly about the first and the greatest commandment is to do what? Love God. And the second is to love your neighbor. That's exactly right. We continue to do that. We're going to keep reminding ourselves of that. And the Bible emphasizes over and over again, it does not matter how spiritual you assume to be or claim to be in your personal relationship with God, if you do not have a good relationship or if you cannot learn to love your neighbor. And we'll have other verses and other continuing thoughts that bring that out. We have to figure out what it means to love our neighbor. So we have to examine what it means to love, and then we have to answer the question, who is my neighbor? And we've been doing the who is my neighbor part for a little while. We've kind of covered that, in the parable of the Good Samaritan and the lessons on that Jesus taught there, and somebody summarize or remind us exactly who it is that we're supposed to consider to be our neighbor. Rogers? Roger's neighborhood. He is Mr. Roger. Man, that's a great segue, but it's the truth, isn't it? Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Who was Mr. Rogers? Actually, that's a great point. Why did he call the show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? Was it just about the people that lived next door to him? No. Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Well, it was huge. And then and that's exactly right. There have actually been 2 documentary movies that have been produced just in the last year. Just 2018, there were 2 separate documentaries produced about Fred Rogers and his, life and why Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood became as big as it did. But his concept to pass on to the next generations that watched him for those decades was that our neighborhood is bigger than just the people that look like us and talk like us. And he reached out in so many good ways to make connections with his neighbor and to show that everyone could be in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood.
And his sweater is on display at the Smithsonian.
He does have an outfit. I think his shoes as well. His shoes and his sweater are in a display at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., which is just a testament to what a lasting impact he made. What am I missing there in the back, ladies? You want to share something? Oh, it's just warm. I got you. I do see a group fanning right back there, so we can fix that. We provided blankets for people that are cold, but not many people are using the blankets most weeks, but we're working on it. So Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood does bring up the good example. Who is my neighbor? That is why he called it Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, because he wanted to create a community, teach people about being a part of a community. Those things are good. The parable reminds us, who is my neighbor? The one who showed mercy, or the one who showed kindness. And Jesus told the lawyer, you go and do likewise. You go be a good neighbor to those who you come into contact with. Peter learned the lesson the hard way. Peter learned the lesson the hard way. What is the conflict between Peter and Paul in Galatians chapter 2? Some of you may have read this before or looked into this. But why do Peter and Paul get into an argument in Galatians chapter 2? All right, there's this issue of Jew and Gentile, of circumcision, and the circumcised and the uncircumcised, which is a prerogative term, a pejorative term. It's a loaded phrase between Jews and Gentiles. The distinction between Jews and Gentiles. Actually, for a Gentile to call a Jew a circumcised was an insult to the Jew. Gentiles looked at the practice of circumcision, and let's be perfectly honest, it is a little barbaric. It is a little extreme to talk about the process, the physical, medical process of circumcision. It's not pleasant to consider. And so Gentiles called Jews the circumcised as an insult to them, because how could you possibly do that to people? Jews, on the other hand, called Gentiles the uncircumcised, and it was an insult to Gentiles. So if a Jew was wanting to insult Gentiles, he could call them the uncircumcised, and it meant they were outcast, they were not pure, they were not in a covenant with God, because circumcision represented the relationship with God. So either way, the words circumcised and uncircumcised were insults. Go ahead. Isn't that's fascinating? You know, Paul will say, God gave me the apostleship to the Gentiles, and he gave Peter the apostleship to the Jews, which doesn't make any sense logically. Because if you're going to pick, according to human wisdom, if you're going to pick the best person to talk to Jews, you want a Jewish authority, right? And there is no bigger Jewish authority than Paul. Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees, of the tribe of Benjamin. You know, he can give you his resume. He can give you his bona fides, all day long about what a great Jew he was. And God said, you're such a good Jew that I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. Well, and that's when we see how God works, we learn the wisdom that God possesses that we wouldn't think of. Because when it comes to Peter, what kind of bona fides did Peter have? What did Peter's resume look like to the Jewish religious leaders of the day? It didn't. That's exactly right. It was nothing. Peter was from the backwoods. He was uneducated. He was just a fisherman. There wasn't anything worth listening to. He hadn't been a rabbi. He hadn't gone to rabbinical school. He wasn't he wasn't a prophet or the son of a prophet. Nothing good about Peter, and yet God says Peter's going to be the one to keep preaching to these Jews. Peter's going to be the one that keeps talking to the Jews. Neither one of them wanted to do it, did they? That's right. Brother Lewis makes a great point. God had to specifically talk to both of them and say, I'm sending you to do this job. I'm sending you to do this work. So don't reject the work, the ministry that I have called you to. Well, apparently Peter took his job very, very seriously. In fact, he took the pendulum and swung it too far. He took God's ministry that he had given him to the Jews, and he took it so far that in Galatians chapter 2, the Bible says that Paul withstood Peter to the face. Now, if Peter is the first pope, as some groups claim, you don't get to withstand the pope to the face. That's not something that happens. But to show the severity of this situation and to show the equality of God's ministers, apostles, and teachers, in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 11, it says, when Cephas came to Antioch, now Cephas is another word for Peter, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. So we're talking about Peter here getting himself into trouble. Now luckily for Peter, he was used to that. This was not a new scenario for Peter. Peter struggled his whole life when he followed Jesus to make the right decisions all the time. So Peter hopefully was used to being corrected when it needed to happen. But exactly what was Peter doing that was wrong that Paul wanted to point out? His attitude and his association with the Gentiles. This is after Acts 10. That's exactly right.
And then he goes to Antioch, and when they come from
I mean, Lewis is giving us the history here that we have to remember. In Acts chapter 10, God meets Peter on the roof of a house and sends him the vision of these unclean animals coming down. And that's when God tells Peter, eat. And Peter says, these things are unclean. I'm not going to eat these things that are unclean because that would make me unclean. And then God's response all three times. Why does God have to tell Peter things three times? You get that? Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Three times. Three denials. This pattern of threes for Peter. But God says, what God has called clean, don't call unclean. Now, we've looked at this before. Does the lesson apply to animals? Is this really about what's kosher to eat for your meal? Is that what this vision is about? God's not telling Peter, hey, you can go to the sushi bar now. That's not what matters. What matters about this vision? What is the lesson to learn here? The Gentiles are not unclean. The Gentiles are not unclean. Remember, these, and this is an important lesson, just like when we talked about don't muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain. Paul says that's not talking about oxen there. The specific commandment applies to oxen, but it's said for our benefit how we're going to deal with people. Peter's vision for the clean and unclean animals is not about what you put on your plate or what you chew in your meal. It's about how you look at people. Okay, do you see this pattern of treating people a certain way? In Acts chapter 10 and Acts chapter 11, Peter gets the message, the Gentiles are just as good as the Jews. God has broken down the wall of separation. And Peter was willing to go along with that to a certain extent. Notice in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 12, it specifically says, for before certain men came from James, that would be Jews from Jerusalem, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. He didn't want Jews talking bad about him, so he changed his behavior and wouldn't fellowship with the Gentiles anymore, even though he knew that it was what he was supposed to be doing. So we're talking about how Peter is treating other people, how Peter is treating Christians, but more specifically, how Peter is treating people who are different from him. That's the real lesson here, okay? The Gentiles are different than Peter. And when he begins to treat them differently, Paul stands up and withstands him to the face. Now here's what I want to point out about this. What is the accusation that Paul makes when he stands up to tell Peter he's wrong? In verse 13, it says the situation got so bad that the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. That must have really hurt Paul, because Paul and Barnabas had split over a disagreement about how to go about their ministry. He may not have seen Barnabas for a long time, and now they're finally in the same place, and he finds Barnabas getting caught up in this problem. Notice what he says in verse 14. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I spoke to Cephas. Now wait a minute. The accusation, what Paul notices, what Paul calls them out on, is not walking in step with what? The truth of the gospel. Now I thought the truth of the gospel, that's a love the Lord your God thing. The gospel is a church thing. That's a religious thing, right? That's a spiritual thing. Is Peter guilty of some spiritual not loving the Lord your God commandment here? Is that what Peter's breaking? No, what commandment is Peter breaking? He's breaking the love your neighbor. He's making an ethical mistake. But Paul very clearly here says if you want to walk in step with the gospel, your actions towards other people are what are going to make that determination. Say that again? It's a pattern. That's exactly right. In step or straightforward. He was not walking in line with. He was not following the truth of the gospel. The truth of the gospel, which is a religious thing, forces us to do what? According to Galatians 2:14. If you're going to walk in step with the gospel, the truth of the gospel, you're going to what? You're going to love your neighbor. It's going to come out in how you treat people.
Another strange thing about this thing is that, if I understand correctly, Acts 15 and the letter sent to the Gentile congregation happened 7 years before this. Peter was part of that.
Peter was definitely part of that. Yep, I'd have to go back and look at the timelines that I have and things, but I don't have any reason to disagree with the statement. In Acts 15, we have Peter and Paul and James and the whole Jerusalem council standing up and saying, you know what, the Gentiles are good. They don't have to follow all these Jewish traditions. That's good for being a Jew, but you don't have to do those things to be a Christian. You don't have to be a Jew in order to be a Christian. And so Peter's supposed to know that, and yet here we find him withdrawing and falling down on the job of treating people right. He's been to Samaria. He's been to Cornelius, who was just a straight up Gentile. He's been a part of the Jerusalem council. There should be no doctrinal reason for him to act the way that he's acting. He fell into an old pattern. Now that's the danger that I'm trying to get us to look at. What are our patterns that don't walk in step with the truth of the gospel?
Brother Adam, the main thing, that gospel was for the Jews and the Gentiles to be saved. I think that's the main thing.
And Galatians is about, he'll talk about the mystery of the gospel. He'll talk about the mystery of Christ a lot in Galatians. And that mystery is, you know what? The Jews and the Gentiles are both on level ground at the cross. Go ahead, Richard, then I'll get to. All right, never mind. Go ahead, Jeff. That's right.
Well, then you look at, Paul had to confront him on this. That was Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. And now we have the example of an apostle treating these people the way he was. And that affects the whole mission of spreading the kingdom. And we can do that too. Somebody identifies me with how I treat other people
Right.
outside the church or even in the church.
Right. That
That
affects.
all the time. They knows by the love we
That's exactly right. That's when you said that. That's the verse I was thinking of.
So this is another reason why Paul had to confront him, because this was a bad example for.
He could not let Peter set that example. That's exactly right. Paul's ministry to the Gentiles meant that he couldn't stand by and just say, well, it'll be okay. We'll get them next time. He had to stand up to Peter and let Peter know that we have to set the right example. I mean, that's what he says. He talks about the example that's being set here. Because, again, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples. All right, when I hear my disciples, I think of love the Lord your God. For by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you what? If you have love one for another. If you love me, keep my commandments. They'll know you're my disciples if you love one another. The rest of the world is going to look at the church, and they're not going to look at its effectiveness based on how big the church building is. And they're not going to be drawn to the promise of the church based on how big the contribution is. They're not going to be drawn to the church by how pretty everybody is. They're going to be drawn to the church because for some reason the people in the church continue loving each other even when they are not intelligent. I was going to use a different word, but we're streaming it on the internet, and I don't want to get in trouble. But our brothers and sisters are sometimes not intelligent, and we still love them. And the rest of the world doesn't do that. In the world, you can be expected to be cut off when things don't work out right. But in the church, we are not to do that because of our love for one another. Richard, what were you going to say?
Years ago, I was preaching for our congregation, and I was in constant trouble with people with the wrong skin color.
Right.
And a man sent me a letter and said that we may all be the same in heaven, but this isn't heaven, this is Mississippi.
This is Mississippi. This isn't heaven. Well, I'd agree with that. But when we're not willing to reach out to people because of a difference, here in the South, I think that race is the easiest one to point out, but it's certainly not the only one to point out. But we can talk about that pretty quickly because we know, and we've talked about it before, it's a good example for us. But there are so many other divisions, there are so many other walls that people put up in front of or between us and them. It's the us or them mentality. And as long as we have an us or them mentality, we don't want to reach out and help them because they're not us. And who does Jesus want to be part of us? Everybody.
Christianity is 100% anti-comfort zone.
That's true. And we've talked about that. My goal in this class and in a lot of my preaching is to make you just uncomfortable enough to realize I've got to be willing to move where God is instead of sitting where I'm really comfortable. The pew is not the only place where we have a comfortable divot worn out from where we sit. It happens to us in life. And sometimes we have to scoot a little bit because God might be a little bit away from where we are. We have talked about not all commandments are equal, and not all sin is the same, and yet they are. This was the lesson last week. This is what we kind of weighed, the conclusion that we reached last week. For somebody that's watching online that didn't hear, or that wasn't a part of class last week, how can we say that at the same time all sins are equal and not all sins are equal? What did we come to the conclusion of last week? How is that possible?
Well, Sister Jane said something about our reward.
Okay, we did. We talked about reward and punishment. On earth, there are different levels of rewards and punishments based on the actions that we take. A crime that you commit, would you rather have somebody steal your bicycle or murder your child? I think that's an easy choice to make. Most of the time, depending on how your kids behave that day. I do understand that. But for the most part, we all know. We know that there's a difference because you can replace a bicycle. The damage done here on this earth is greater or lesser based on the actions that we take. And so when we talk about a lie, not all lies are the same. We talked about this last week. We talked about therapeutic lies, right? Not all lies are the same because lies have different results. Okay? But how many lies does it take to keep you out of heaven? Just one. And does it matter if it's big or little? No. All sin is equal because as soon as you are lawless, right? James says that sin is lawlessness. Anytime you break God's will, you have become uninhabitable in heaven, because heaven is the perfect expression of God's will. It is perfect. The reason it is perfect is because nothing impure or imperfect dwells there. So, if you have any sin, you cannot enter the perfect place, because there is no sin in heaven. If there is sin in heaven, or if there were to be sin in heaven, do you know what would follow close behind? Crying, pain, sickness, all those things that Revelation chapter 21 tell us do not exist in the heavenly Jerusalem. The thing that makes heaven so great is the absence of all those problems. What brings those problems about? Sin. That is why, the picture that I get in my head sometimes is of the Ebola virus, right? Or the Zika, whatever these terrible pandemic-causing diseases are, right? And if somebody flies into Atlanta and they suspect that person of having Ebola, what do they do with that person? Quarantine. They take that person and they put them in a protective environment where what? What is the purpose of quarantine? Keep what they have from spreading. All right? It is a virus, it is a bacteria, it is something harmful, and once it gets into something, it replicates and it spreads and it infects more and more and more people. And let me tell you, folks, there is nothing more contagious or infectious than sin. Nothing. It doesn't take the smallest little sin to replicate. Just think of gossip. How big does gossip start? And it's usually just a tiny little whisper of a thing. And then before you know it, it's turned into a monster that nobody can control. And every sin works that way. Every sin looks that way. Okay? So sin has to be quarantined from heaven. You can't let any sin, no matter how big or small you think it is. That's why when you go to, Terry Oakley, Terry was talking when they went to Haiti a couple weeks ago. And if you've ever gone out of the country, you might be familiar with this. Arvie asked Terry if he would bring back some soil samples from the ground where they're building the orphanage in Haiti. So Terry and Todd and some of the other folks went over there, and they're helping to build. And Arvie says we need to take some soil samples to get them tested, make sure everything's good. Well, Terry was scared to death. Why was Terry worried about this request? Yeah, you can't bring organic material into the United States from a foreign country. You've heard the horror stories of bananas coming in from the Caribbean or something like that, and they open it up, and there's a 30-pound tarantula in there. I might be exaggerating just a little bit, but a tarantula is a tarantula in my book, so it doesn't really matter. I don't care how big it is. Probably when it started on that boat, the tarantula was only the size of my thumb. It was probably a little bitty baby. But by the time it had been chewing on them nanners, coming across the water, having a little cruise, it gets here and it's grown. That's what sin is. You can't let that organic material cross cross into our border, because you don't know what it's bringing in with it. You don't know what diseases or germs or just things that in its native land don't cause any problem at all. But once it gets into another country where those bacteria or diseases or whatever aren't prevalent, they cause havoc. It's like introducing, the wrong species into a water system or something like that. You take your boat and you travel down to the Gulf, or you travel somewhere in another part of the country, and your boat gets some kind of algae on it. And then you don't clean your boat off, and you put it here in, Pickwick, something like that, put in there at Wheeler Dam, and you introduce that algae or that whatever into the water system, and we've got a problem. We've got an invasive species. So we have to... Excuse me. We've got to make sure that things that don't belong stay out, because otherwise they will take over. Kudzu is not native to South America, to the southern United States, right? Come from Japan. Kudzu's not supposed to be here. They gave it to us as a gift. Oh, well, the gift that keeps on giving. And it got in, and you know what kudzu does. It just takes over. It takes over. So we have to keep the invasive species out. And in heaven, the invasive species is sin. And when sin gets in, it causes havoc. It brings all manner of disease and sadness and grief and problem. And so God says, no, it doesn't come in here. So if you get to the door and you knock on those quote unquote pearly gates and you've still got sin, I'm sorry. Who does God want in heaven? What will God want to do when you knock on the pearly gates, but you've still got sin covering your soul? He wants to let you in. But if that sin has not been expiated, if it has not been paid for, if it has not been redeemed, if it has not been nailed to the cross, then you're stuck with it. And just like in the hospital, with those quarantined people who are suffering, we want to let them out. We want to hug them. We want to embrace them, but we cannot. And that's how it works in heaven. And so for us, it doesn't matter how big or little the virus is that you have. It will infect everything, so it has to be gone. And that's why all sin is equal, because in eternity, the consequence is the same. But here on earth, the consequences are different, and we have to take that into account. And that's why we have scenarios, even in Scripture, where someone has to choose between doing two bad things. There are real dilemmas that we can't just escape from that we find in Scripture. We're going to look at in just a second.
That's the reason in Revelation it says all liars.
The place, I don't know why we sing Revelation 21:8 with a smile on our face. That is not a ditty. That's a sad song. But liars, cowards are in the same boat with sorcerers and with others, because the eternal consequences are exactly the same. That's exactly right. Turn to Joshua chapter 2. Here's a good example. Joshua chapter 2. Anybody ever heard of Rahab before? Was Rahab a Jewish lady? No. What was Rahab? She was a prostitute in the city of Jericho. That's about as bad as it can get. Jericho is the enemy of the Jewish people. Prostitutes, not typically looked upon favorably in society. And yet, Rahab gets to be included in some pretty important lists through the years. What are some of those important lists that she gets included in? She's in the lineage or the genealogy of Jesus Christ himself. Without Rahab, we don't get Jesus. And then the second one I think of, actually two other times in the New Testament we talk about Rahab. She's found in Hebrews chapter 11, which is the chapter of what? The heroes of the faith. She is a hero of the faith. And then in the book of James, when it talks about faith without works is dead, it says, you know that Abraham was justified by his works, and so was Rahab when she did what? What did Rahab do, according to James chapter 2, that made her in the same category as Abraham for demonstrating her faith? She what? Hid the spies. Right? We know the story of Rahab. We know that before the Israelites marched around the city of Jericho 7 times, blew their trumpets, and the walls fell down, that there is one house left standing in that destruction. And it's the house of Rahab the harlot, because she demonstrated faith in God because she hid the spies. But we have a problem, because Rahab is not just a harlot, she's a liar. What do I mean? Right? Rahab chapter 2. We get pretty early on into the chapter. let's see, it starts off pretty simple. Joshua sent these spies into the land. 2 spies went to Rahab and lodged there. In verse 2, it was told to the king of Jericho, the Israelites have come here tonight to search out our land. And the king sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and she said, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I don't know where the men went. That's how the English Standard Version phrases it. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. So what does she quite literally say? They went that way. Now, when we talk about trying to get out of telling an untruth, we say, well, maybe I just won't tell them. If somebody asks me a question, I'll just dodge, I'll just divert. I won't tell an outright lie, but I won't answer the question that they want to hear. Is that what Rahab did? What did Rahab do when she was asked point blank, where are these men? She said, oh yeah, they were here for a little bit, and then they left and they went that way. And that is a lie. But I thought lying was bad. Go to Exodus. Ow, I just kicked it. Go to Exodus. I'm getting so excited I can't even walk straight. Anybody know Shiphrah and Puah? You ever heard of Shiphrah and Puah? Maybe not as famous as Rahab, but they should be. Shiphrah and Puah were the Jewish midwives in Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1 begins by reminding us that there arose in Egypt a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph or the good things that he had done and the good relationship that should exist between Egypt and Israel. And as Israel continued to grow strong and prosperous, the Egyptians became afraid, and the Pharaoh decided to oppress the Israelites. He made their work harder, he enslaved them, he set them to be laborers in building and other things like that. And then in order to control the population so that the Israelites would not grow more numerous, he said, if it's a baby girl, no problem. But if a Hebrew boy is born, what are you supposed to do with it? You throw it in the river for the crocodiles. Sounds like a great place to live, doesn't it? You throw that newborn baby into the river and let the crocodiles have it. And he goes to Shiphrah and Puah and says, when you deliver an Israelite child, if that child is a girl, no problem. But if it's a boy, take it outside, throw it in the river. How would you like to be a Hebrew midwife? Would that be a job in Egypt? Not at all. But these ladies had a decision to make, and they made it. And in verse 15, that's the command. Verse 16, that's the command. But in verse 17, it says that the midwives, what was their mindset, first of all? The midwives feared God. Okay? The midwives feared God, and because they feared God, what did they do? They lied. They did not obey the government, and they lied because they feared God. Boy, this is getting confusing, friends. But that's what they did. What did they say to Pharaoh? Man, I would love to throw that little baby in the Nile River. There's nothing I'd rather do. But those Israelite women, they're a tough bunch of broads, let me tell you. And before we can get there, they have had that baby and hidden it from us. And I didn't get to throw that baby in the Nile River. Now, is that a true statement? That's not the truth. That's a lie. They're going and delivering those babies, and they're not killing them. And they lied because they feared God. But I thought lying was wrong. I thought lying was bad. We have the modern example, which is easy to look at. It's 1941, and you live in Poland, right? 1941, you're a good, upstanding Polish citizen, and you live next door to a Jewish clock shop owner. He makes and repairs clocks. He's a good guy. You've gotten along, lived together next door to each other for 20 plus years, but when Germany overruns Poland, they begin to make some changes to the rules. And the first thing that they do is they tell all the Jews, you can't live in your house anymore, but we're going to build you your own place. They called it the ghetto. Initially, they sent them to apartments that they built, and they pushed all of the Jews into that place. And then they started making them wear the star so they could be identified. And then when you wore the star, they didn't have to serve you in the restaurants or let you into the businesses or honor their agreements and contracts. Second-class citizen stuff started happening. But then they started disappearing. And there's rumors about what's happening, but nobody really knows. Some people just say, well, they're just kicking them out of Poland. They can't live here anymore, so they're having to go to other countries to live. Or they're telling them that, but you see less and less of your neighbors. And the other rumors are not so good. The other rumors are that they put train loads of them and send them off to some prison. For a long time, that's all you know. It's just a prison. It's not great. But then there are rumors that what happens at these prisons, these concentration camps, are pretty horrific, the way that they're being treated. And then the SS soldiers from the German Reich are coming, and they're making sure that they have cleaned up your city of all these nasty Jews. If they're not in the ghetto where they belong, if they haven't been shipped off to the concentration camp, it is illegal for them to be here. And when we find them, we shoot them because they're lawbreakers and they're second class. They're not humans, really. And at 10 o'clock at night, and you drop your Bible right off of the podium. No. You go to answer the door, and it's your Jewish neighbor who you haven't seen in weeks. And he and his family are desperately looking and asking you if they can come inside and hide, because there's a detachment of German soldiers sweeping through, going door to door, looking in all the nooks and crannies for Jews who don't belong. They drag them out into the street and they shoot them in the head. And you open the door to your Jewish neighbor who wants to come in. Now, my first question is, who's going to let their neighbor come into their house? First and foremost. Right? And I'm not going to put you on the spot. In every other class, I wanted show of hands. I really feel like I should to you guys. But I'm scared of some of you, so I won't. But the first question is, would you let those people in your house in the first place? Because as soon as you let them